Hello everyone, Sam here, and today we're going to talk about Fair Margaret. This is going to be my last entry for the Haggard January event. I realized this is coming out in March. I got caught up with a work project, so a lot of this Haggard January stuff kind of fell on the back burner for a bit. Not the actual reading though. I finished the reading in the first week or so of February, so I was able to complete this, but I wasn't able to make a recording about it until now. But we're going to do that now. So thank you very much for your patience for anyone who was waiting. I don't have a physical copy of this book. I read it digitally. I read it on actually Project Gutenberg, and I'll leave a link in the description for anyone who wants to read it at that source. So, since this is a Haggard January book, I figured it'd be best to finish the series with a Haggard book. This story was written by Rider Haggard and was published in 1907. And this actually came out during a very interesting period in Haggard's career. Because if you saw my video review of Rider Haggard by Norman E. Therington, you'll know a little about this. But there was this period where H. Rider Haggard was kind of putting jungle adventures to the side. He was just sort of giving up on him, partially because at the time exploration of the world had increased so much that by the 1890s, around the mid 1890s, he kind of went, well, these lost worlds and these African adventures I'm writing, are they really plausible anymore? He was just kind of getting under the impression that the Lost World genre was now kind of passé, and that, these adventures into new worlds were just not feasible, or at least as feasible as he had originally thought they were. So around this period, he had gotten into an obsession with what E. Therington called historical romances. And these were stories that were more focused on historical adventures rather than his contemporary African adventures or a lot of his Lost World stuff. Now, he still did make Lost World material. He actually had done The Return of She in 1905, 2 years before this story. So he hadn't completely abandoned it, but he had gotten fixated on historical romances because he sort of believed that if you couldn't do a Lost World story because the Earth had been fully explored, or at least mostly explored, you would have to go back into the past in order to escape from the current world. And so historical romances were kind of his way of doing that escape. If he couldn't do a Lost World, he could do a historical story. So this was, and this period where he was focused on historical romances was essentially 20 years, going from the tale Nada the Lily which was released in 1892, to the story Marie in 1912. And during this 20-year period, there were no new Alan Quatermain stories, who is Haggard's biggest character. Like I said, Aisha returned in The Return of She during this period, but Quatermain was out during this very long period. Haggard didn't do any new stories with him. So, this story comes out in a very interesting point in Haggard's career, and thus it's actually a very good story to read when looking at how Haggard was using historical romances when during this period in his career where he was sort of, he hadn't abandoned Lost World stories, but he was definitely not emphasizing them as much. So that was kind of the mindset Haggard was approaching this story. I was interested in this story even before I knew about this period in Haggard's career. I became interested in this story for a very simple reason. Nobody seemed to be talking about it. Like, a lot of Haggard's works, even his, like, Victorian dramas that were not adventure stories, those at least have stuff written about him, people discussing how they differ from his Lost World tales. But I could find virtually nothing about Fair Margaret. Like, this story was just a black hole where no literary critic who examined Haggard ever touched it. There were barely any reviews about it. So, you know, I saw everybody else who was doing Haggard January doing, you know, the other common Haggard novels like Eric Bright Eyes, Nada the Lily, Montezuma's Daughter. And I was just kind of like, well, I really want to do one that not only is nobody else doing that was participating in Haggard January, but one that it seems like nobody was really talking about. So I chose Fair Margaret for that reason. The fact that nobody seemed to really say anything about it and mention it either in the present or in the past. So that was my main reason for choosing this story for Haggard January. Just a moment. So with all that discussion, what is the plot actually about for Fair Margaret? Well, the plot is, it takes place in, or at least it starts, in England in the year 1494. Because it said 1494, it's not directly said the year, but the insinuation is that it's 1494. Based on the time passed between a certain historical event and the story. So the story is 1494, and the main character is a man named Peter Brome. And he's a novice tradesman who's been working with John Castell, who is a in-law of one of the cousins of Castell's mother. He's not a blood relation, he's an in-law. And Peter started working with him because Peter used to be a noble. He used to be part of a noble English family. But unfortunately, he lost his father's lands because Peter had sided with Richard III. And if you have any knowledge of English history, Richard III was overthrown by his brother, Henry VII, I believe. Henry VII. And they had this sort of minor civil war over who was going to rule England, and Richard III was overthrown. And since both Peter and his father had sided with Richard instead of Henry, they were punished by having their lands dispossessed. And Henry VII dispossessed them. He didn't arrest them. He didn't kill anybody in their family. He simply dispossessed them as punishment. So Peter's been working as a tradesman for the last 7 years to get by, because John Castell took him in essentially out of the goodness of his heart. He didn't want to see Peter suffer. And Peter has decided that he is going to propose marriage to John Castell's daughter, Margaret Castell. She is the titular Fair Margaret. And, you know, Peter, he's not a great tradesman, but he's made enough of a living that he can support Margaret, and John Castell is more than happy to support their union and to support their marriage. But of course, in a Haggard story, things never quite go to plan, because it turns out Peter and Margaret go to this big parade, and the scuffle breaks out, and Peter ends up killing a soldier who was in the employ of the Spanish ambassador. So he gets into a little bit of hot water with that, and even worse, another Spanish officer, who is this Spanish marquis named d'Aguilar, this fight causes d'Aguilar to notice Margaret and decides he wants Margaret for his wife. Now, initially, Margaret pushes against him. She refuses his advances, and she's gonna stay loyal to Peter. But d'Aguilar is persistent. He cooks up a scheme where he seduces Margaret's cousin Betty and uses her to trick Margaret and Betty to come onto his ship. And once he's got them on his ship, he quickly whisks them away out of England to Granada, which, for those that don't know, Granada was the southern kingdom of the Moors just before it was conquered by the Christian Spanish kingdom. This is right at the tail end of the Reconquista, where Christian Spain reconquered Spain, the Iberian Peninsula for Spain, and the Muslim Moors were pushed out. So at this point in time, the Moors are still there, and d'Aguilar takes Margaret and Betty to Granada, which is controlled by the Moors. Naturally, Peter is not happy about this, and he gives chase. And John Castell comes with him, but there's a wrinkle with Castell, because John turns out to have actually been an unconverted Jew. His father was Spanish, and he fled Spain to England when John was very young. And they fled because the Spanish Inquisition came into power. And if you know anything about the Spanish Inquisition, they were not the biggest fan of Jews. So Castell is really putting a risk here, going with Peter to Spain, because if the Spanish Inquisition catches him and they figure out he's an unconverted Jew, it's not going to end well for him. So John and Peter basically have to rescue both Margaret and Betty from the Marquis, and also avoid the eyes of the Inquisition. And that becomes the main thrust of the story. How are they going to get them back while not angering the complex politics of the Spanish government? So that is the essential setup of the story. So I'll first talk about what works in this story, because there are a lot of things here that I did really enjoy. The first thing I really liked is that I really liked the setting of the story, particularly in terms of the time period, because this is actually a really interesting point in European history, because this was when England was still recovering from the minor civil war that had gone on between Richard and Henry, and thus they're actually not really the strongest nation in Europe. They're kind of off their game a bit. They're still recovering from that, and they're also still Catholic, because this is not Henry VIII. This is Henry VII. So the Anglican Church that would eventually come off and kind of move away from Catholicism is not here yet. So there's kind of an interesting thing there, where England is still Catholic. And this is actually in that time when Spain is kind of the big dog in Europe, because they are at the tail end of the Reconquista. They're about to completely take over the Iberian Peninsula. This is right around the time they've sent Columbus out to find the New World, and Spain is going to make massive gains conquering the New World. So this is kind of when Spain is the big dog, and England is, not a small fish, but they're not the biggest fish. And it kind of plays into it actually works very well for the dynamics of the story, because you have this powerful Spanish marquis who is taking advantage of an English woman, and sort of seeing this English soldier as kind of the underdog who has to fight against these odds. So it works very well to have this story situation at this period in history. And it works at reflecting the character dynamics, too. I also really liked a lot of the action scenes in this story. Haggard really had a good knack for writing action. And there's a lot of great action scenes in this story. Like, there's this point where John Castell's boat has managed to pull up to the Marquis' boat, and both the Marquis and John Castell's men are getting into a fight with each other on the ship, and they're trying to board. Each one's trying to board the other, and they're fighting. And of course, a storm breaks out because you got to make it more dramatic. But it's a very good fight scene. There's also this scene where Peter and John are at an inn in Spanish territory, and they're attacked by bandits. And they have to kind of figure out a way to escape from the bandits who have basically controlled the inn. So that's a good one. And there's also the final battle where Peter and the Marquis finally get into a jousting and then sword fighting fight to the death. And it's right in front of the Spanish monarchs of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. I won't spoil how that situation comes about, but it very much is the climax of the story. And I also, there's a lot of good characters in this story. I just mentioned Queen Isabella. Queen Isabella is actually really interesting because she's actually very multifaceted. She's initially presented as like this religious fanatic who's going to destroy all the Jews and the Muslims in Spain, and she's so vicious in her push for conquering Spain that that even some of the Spanish officers are like, she's a little much. But she kind of has this interesting character element where she's actually very warm towards some of the characters, particularly Margaret, because when she learns what's going on with Margaret, she's actually the more sympathetic of the monarchs towards Margaret's plight. King Ferdinand is not, mostly because the Marquis d'Aguilar is his nephew. So there's a bit of thing there, and it's very clear in the story that Isabella and d'Aguilar do not like each other. So there's kind of an interesting thing there with Isabella being a more complex character than initially presented as. Probably my favorite character of this story is Betty, Margaret's cousin, who is seduced by d'Aguilar in order to trick Margaret into coming. Betty, it really is the standout character because for the first half of the story, she's not that interesting. She's just kind of meant to be the second fiddle, the friend of the female character who is simply meant to contrast with the main woman's virtues. Just that typical foil kind of character. But once the second half comes and once Betty realizes what's going on, there's like this weird switch where she goes from being a jilted lover to suddenly being this like very clever schemer who realizes, oh, the Marquis is messed with me in this way. Well, I'm going to find a way to mess with him. And she finds a very clever and creative way to get her revenge on the Marquis. And it's a way that is actually very, very smart. And I won't say how she gets her revenge, but it's in a way that is very very much giving the Marquis what he wants, but not in the way that he wants it. She's probably the best character in this story because she has a great arc of sort of finding a way to get her revenge. I also really liked John Castell, Margaret's father, because he has this really strong arc where he goes from a man who spent years, decades even, hiding his Jewish ancestry, because England, not only would Spain harm him if they found out he was Jew, England would harm him too, because, it's just because the English aren't as fervent about the Jews as Spain is, that doesn't mean he would be in the best place in England. So he's hid his Jewish ancestry for decades, and kind of the main arc he has is sort of slowly realizing he has to kind of accept his Jewishness and not keep it secret any longer in order to save his daughter. And this is actually a really interesting character thing of him deciding to fully accept his Jewishness and the consequences, and him basically finally revealing who he truly is. And it's actually interesting because Norman E. Therington, in that Rider Haggard book I mentioned, he stated that Haggard was a lot more open-minded towards Jews compared to a lot of his contemporary writers, partially because he says that Haggard suspected he might have had some Jewish ancestry. So he supposedly was a little more kind to Jewish characters than some of his contemporaries were. And apparently a lot of his other books focus on Jewish characters too, so this was a recurring thing with Haggard. And there's also a character named Inez, who is a slave girl in Granada. She works in the Marquis' household. And kind of like Betty, she's sort of this crafty woman who uses her wits to help Peter and Margaret escape from the Marquis, but doing it in ways that she can hide her involvement. And so she can sort of slowly escape, because this is kind of, she also wants revenge on the Marquis. So she's a very fun character too. And probably the last character I really liked was Captain Smith. He's the one that's running John Castell's boat, and he's actually the one that like directs that ship fight I mentioned earlier. He's the one that does that, and he's the one that actually at one point arranges a rescue of John Castell and performs this great maneuver by ramming Spanish ships in order to escape them. So he's a very cool character that isn't in it a lot, but when he acts, it's a lot of fun. So a lot of really fun characters in this story. So with all that said, I now have to move on to the things that I don't think work in the story. And unfortunately, there's quite a bit of it, because this is one of those stories that for every good thing it does about two or three things bad. And it really drags the story down, with each new problem you recognize. I think the first problem, this was the first one that really stood out to me, is that the story really drags in a lot of places. There's just these long periods where not much is happening, or what's going on is not terribly interesting. And probably the worst instance of this is the beginning, because all of that buildup I said in the plot, where the Marquis kidnaps Margaret and Betty. You probably heard all that and said, oh, well, that probably happens in like the third or fourth chapter. Happens really? No. It happens in the ninth chapter. The ninth chapter. And out of a 26 chapter story, meaning you have to get a third of the way into the story for the story to really kick off. So you've just got a lot of stuff of people talking and, planning and ideas they have and their feelings. And it's like, that could work, but it doesn't work here. It's just sort of prolonging what we're waiting for. We're waiting for the chase to start, and it just doesn't start until a third of the story is done. So that was quite irritating. And one of the big reasons this happens is that in the beginning, I made it sound, when I was giving the plot, I made it sound like, oh, Peter and Margaret are already betrothed and they're going to be married when the Marquis comes in and ruins everything. Well, no, it turns out at the very beginning of the story, they are not engaged. In fact, they're not even really lovers. They're kind of, they're almost to the point of being lovers, but they're not really. They're still kind of like, they're kind of shy about doing anything. And so it's kind of, they don't even know the other one likes them all that much, enough to marry them at the very beginning of the story. And they have to take several of the first few chapters to actually reveal their love to each other. And this eats up a fair amount of the word count of them starting to put together, oh, actually this guy who's been very fond of me and being nice to me, think, oh, he actually likes me and wants to marry me. And it's like, okay. And yes, I know courtships take a while to build up, but this is one of those stories where I'm like, oh, you gotta open with that, with them already being betrothed, because doing it like this, where it takes so long for them to learn they love each other, it's kind of like, it just eats up time, and it puts off the adventure from really happening, and it doesn't work as build up, because it's kind of like, well, if I saw that they were, because if they were just betrothed from the start of the story, you'd know, oh yeah, they probably care about each other, and you would still feel bad when the Marquis snatches Margaret. But here, it's kind of like Harry said, oh no, they really need to understand that they love each other, so I'm going to show them going from, fond of each other to betrothed, and I'm going to show several chapters of that build-up, and it's like, yeah, that just doesn't gel very well. It just eats up a lot of time. And that kind of ties into the next problem of the story, is that there are a lot of really long scenes of people talking and plotting than there are with action scenes. Like that 9-chapter opening, the only real action scene is the brief fight with the soldier that gets Peter into trouble, and then after that, there's really nothing else for several chapters. And then you get to chapter 9. After that, it picks up a bit, but even then, the action scenes go on for 2 or 3 chapters, then they're out for the bit until they start making their way to Seville, where Queen Isabella is, and it's just kind of like there's just way too many gaps between any action scenes, and a lot of this is just talking and conversing and trying to do this like heightened royalty speak among the characters, and it just isn't engaging. A lot of the strong writing that Haggard had for King Solomon's Mines that worked really well, it's not really here. The dialogue just does not work, and there's a reason for that I'll get to in a little bit, but there's just not enough going on here of the dialogue. And as I mentioned, the action scenes are spread so far apart and have such long gaps between them that the story is mostly talking than action, and it's kind of like talking does not seem to have been Haggard's main gift of writing. He seemed much more better with action and things happening other than dialogue. And here it just does not. He focuses so much on dialogue that you kind of go, okay. So you're gonna talk about something rather than doing it. Okay, all right. It's just not engaging. There's also a problem is that there's a lot of these plot threads that are kind of dangled in front of the reader. You think, oh well, they're going to be the characters are going to do this because this plot thread's dangled in front of you. But then the story never follows up on it, and never follows through with them. It's frustrating because a lot of these plot threads are really interesting. You think, oh, how's the character gonna do this? For instance, at one point, John Castell gets captured by the Moors in Granada, and you think, oh well, the Marquis is gonna do something with him in order to force Margaret to marry him. But then he escapes off screen, or off page in this case. Peter goes to sleep, and when he wakes up, John Castell has magically escaped. And it's kind of like, well, there was a great setup there about how Peter was going to try to get John out, how Margaret was going to react once she knew the Marquis had her father. Like, there was kind of an interesting plot there, but it's just dropped completely. Haggard just goes, no, he's captured. He escaped easily. He had some Jewish friends. They had him escape. And it's kind of like, well, why did you set that up if you weren't going to do anything with it? And something similar kind of happens towards the end, where the Marquis is kind of on the ropes because Queen Isabella has an inkling of what's going on with him and Margaret. So there's this setup that the Marquis is going to blackmail Margaret into marrying him by threatening to expose John, right in the middle of Spanish court, accuse him of being a Jew. And you think, oh, well, that's kind of an interesting, how's he going to play that? But then when the scene actually happens, he doesn't even bother trying to talk to Margaret privately to blackmail her. He just blurts out the accusation right in the middle of the court. And while this does cause problems for John, it is kind of a thing of, well, you just gave your last trump card that you were going to hold over Margaret. Now you have to fight Peter to the death. So it's kind of like, there's all these interesting plot setups, but they're not really followed through. It just feels like Haggard was kind of wrote with this one idea, but then he kind of changed what he was going to do in a later chapter, but forgot to go back and change what he'd initially written for that preceding chapter. So there's just a lot of moments like that where things are set up but then they don't pay off or they don't follow through. It's just very strange. Strange to read that kind of thing. Now, earlier I was praising a lot of characters. I said I really liked Betty and John Castell, Inez, all of those people. And I do. I still do. But the problem is that all of those characters are mostly secondary characters. And the main characters, Peter and Margaret, are very dull. They are very, very dull. Because Peter, he's just the typical hot-blooded man of action. You know, someone disrespects his woman, he flies into a rage and starts sword fighting people. It's like, it's a character type you've seen tons of times before, and Haggard doesn't really add anything new to this kind of character. Margaret is actually much more frustrating because she's the typical fair maiden, you know, the typical one who, the typical Victorian era hero. I know the story doesn't take place during the Victorian era, but she's kind of written with that same idea of like the fair maiden, like it's called Fair Margaret. The fair maiden who's so beautiful, everyone wants her. She's so wonderful and so lovely. And there's not much else to her other than just being the fair maiden. And but unlike Peter, who's just kind of bland, there's a lot of points where Margaret is kind of insufferably dumb. And some things she falls for, it makes sense. Like the whole reason the Marquis tricks her and Betty to coming on his ship is that he fakes that it's John Castell's ship and that John Castell's injured, and he manages to trick her into coming on board by that. That's a trick that makes sense. You can see why she falls for it. But then there's one where at one point the Marquis has Peter, and the Marquis sets things up to where Peter is seemingly in love with one of his servants. He's not. He's still looking for Margaret, but he set it up in a way that Peter will look like he's cheating on Margaret. And the Marquis has brought it so to where Margaret can look in and see Peter cheating. And it's so obviously a trick. And it's not even a thing of, you can say like, oh, well, the character wouldn't know that. Like, Peter is being held hostage by the Marquis. The Marquis, who has threatened his life, has killed people by this point. And you don't think that Peter might be being coerced into doing something that this man who has threatened to kill him multiple times, you might think you might think Peter's being coerced in some way, but she 100% falls for this thing of, oh, Peter's cheating on me, and she like rejects it and goes, oh, how could he do such a thing? It's like, yeah, how could he do such a thing based on the circumstances you're in? And she believes this for like a whole chapter until Inez comes in and says, well, no, he's obviously not doing it. We arranged that. The Marquis arranged that in order to get you off Peter, get you to stop thinking about Peter. And it's kind of like, yeah, this is how are you not reading the room, Margaret? How do you think this setup is not weird at all? And in fact, probably the most irritating thing is that Margaret is kind of responsible for all the things that happen in the story, because the whole conflict starts because both John Castell and Peter took her to see a parade where King Henry VII was going by. And both John and Peter told him, hey, look, don't go here to watch the parade. There's a lot of ruffians and, bad guys here. They might see you decked out in this beautiful dress and get, like, get the bad idea. But she goes, no, I want to see it at the best possible vantage point. We will go there, and it will be fine. And it's not fine. She gets the attraction of the one Spanish soldier, and that leads to all the problems. It's what causes D'Aguilar to notice her, and it's kind of like, yeah, Margaret, you kind of caused the whole problem. And then there's times where she acts mad at other people for not doing what she wants, and it's kind of like, well, you didn't do what other people wanted, Margaret. Like, why are you getting so mad? And what those people wanted was actually to your benefit. So it's kind of like, yeah, there's a lot of points where she kind of becomes a little unlikable. The only good moment she has, and this moment is actually depicted on the cover of the thumbnail in this video. The only good moment is where she's first on the boat and she realizes the Marquis has tricked her. And you think she's gonna, like, do a huge speech decrying the Marquis. No, she immediately grabs a knife and tries to stab the Marquis to death. And it's only prevented because Betty stops her. So that's the one good moment she has, where she doesn't do any of this fawning or woe is me sort of stuff. She just immediately tries to kill the Marquis the second she realizes his treachery. So that's a fun moment. But it's really the only moment she gets where I'm like, oh, okay, you have something to you. The rest of it, I'm just like, Margaret, you're messing things up again. It's funny because Betty technically has done more to cause the problem than Margaret, but Betty actually has a much more interesting arc, so I'm less mad about her. Well, and also there's the Marquis himself. Marquis D'Aguilar is a pretty one-note villain. Like, he's the typical scheming villain. He wants to get the fair maiden, so he plots to get her. And Haggard tries to add this one little element where D'Aguilar won't kill a man in cold blood. That's the reason when Peter is his prisoner, he won't kill him. Because he has this, like, religious conviction, because he's part Moor and part Spanish, so he's kind of has this weird conflict with religion. Like, he's technically Christian, he still believes in the Christian ways, but he has, like, this weird conflict within him, and the one dastardly deed he won't do is kill a man in cold blood. That's why Peter sometimes becomes his prisoner, but he won't kill him because he can't reconcile his faithfulness with that. And in a certain hand, I could see that making an interesting villain, giving them that sort of that one heroic element. But at a certain point, it just kind of becomes a crutch, because eventually it's created a situation where D'Aguilar has Peter at his mercy, but because of this one character trait, he can't just end the problem. And it eventually becomes more annoying than interesting. It just kind of becomes, okay, like, anybody who complains about James Bond villains not killing James Bond, D'Aguilar is that on steroids. There are a lot of times where he could easily get Peter out of the picture, but doesn't. And it eventually stops being an interesting character trait and just sort of an annoying roadblock Haggard has put up to make sure the villain doesn't win too easily. And I remember in one of my writing classes, somebody told me, when a roadblock happens for the hero, it feels more natural because you want the hero to overcome obstacles. But when you do a roadblock constantly for a villain to where they're not able to fully succeed because of something keeps getting in the way, that comes off as like sort of the author doing something in order to keep the story going. Because the villain is supposed to have the easy thing. He's supposed to be the one that does the dastardly deed, and the hero has to spend the story overcoming it. And this story, the Marquis could easily win the day, but he doesn't because of this one character trait. And and aside from that one character trait, he doesn't really have much else going for him. There's an implication that he kind of wants Margaret because when he's married, he might be making machinations to take the Spanish throne. But again, that's a pretty common villain motive. So he just does not stand out. And he's not entertaining enough to really carry the story. And even the ending, he does get a punishment in the end. He does get a comeuppance, but it's not a very satisfying punishment because it's not an immediate punishment. It's sort of a punishment that is a death by 1,000 cuts. He basically suffers this event that sort of slowly kills him, not physically, but mentally. It pretty much drives him nuts and slowly ebbs him down. And it just doesn't feel earned. Like, there are some villains where them sort of slowly losing it and sort of suffering a long-lasting punishment does work, but here it really doesn't because he does enough awful things in the story. You're kind of like, no, I don't want him getting this like essentially a minor inconvenience for several years that eventually wears him down. I kind of want to see him punished right out, but that doesn't happen. His punishment is very prolonged, but it's not even that harsh a punishment. He just sort of perceives it as a harsh punishment. And so it just doesn't really work as a punishment because he's done enough bad things in the story. You're like, no, take him out now. It's like... So, I think the other thing that really bugged me about the story is that Betty and John Castell have the best overall story, at least in terms of their predicaments. Because, you know, Betty has been conned by a man who she thought loved her, and he loves another woman, and she has to get her revenge on him. And then you have John Castell, who's trying to hide his heritage lest he be burned at the stake. And those are the best elements of the story. But they're not really focused on. You have to focus on Peter trying to rescue Margaret. And that's just not as interesting, especially because Peter and Margaret are not that interesting. I really wish Betty and John Castell had been the main characters, because that would have been a way more interesting conflict. Like, this is one of those stories that I kind of wish Margaret was the side... Margaret was kind of the side character and Betty was the main one, because Betty would have been way more interesting. And if John Castell had to go and try to rescue her without Peter, I think that would have been a way more interesting story, because you couldn't focus on Peter's daring soldiery. You would have had to focus on John Castell trying to, like, sort of manipulate his way into Spain and sort of plot how to save his daughter and clever ways. So yeah, the Peter and Margaret's story just doesn't do much because it's so basic. Man rescues lover from evil villain. Betty and John just have way more going on, so I would have rather they'd followed them. And this is the last thing I'll speak of in terms of negatively. The story is very much Haggard not doing his style, the style that made him successful. He's copying another style, and specifically, he is copying the style of the Three Musketeers. I have read the Three Musketeers. I've read half of it, but I've read that first half, and this story very much reads like Haggard is trying to do the Three Musketeers, because it has that like style where cavalier men are saying, "Oh, you say such a thing to me, I do not approve. What have I said to offend you? Oh, this is this, and your implication." You know, that very long-winded dialogue that Alexandre Dumas would do. There's even some plot points that are, like, pretty similar to the Three Musketeers. Like, there's a corrupt clergyman that features heavily in Fair Margaret. So the style of Alexandre Dumas is absolutely here. But the problem is that Haggard doesn't have interesting enough characters to really carry that style like Dumas did in the Three Musketeers. And plus, Haggard was always much more of an action writer anyway. And Dumas wrote action in the Three Musketeers, but it was definitely more focused on the style and the dialogue. And Dumas basically trying to do this swashbuckler story with a certain kind of style to it, and it worked for that story, but I don't think it works when Haggard tries to do it, because it doesn't really speak to Haggard's strengths as a writer. So the actual reading of this story, you might be reading and going, this feels really familiar, and it's like, yeah, it's because Alexandre Dumas did it several decades earlier. So yeah, it really, it became, and because Haggard does that style, it becomes really difficult to read the story. Not necessarily in terms of word usage, you'll understand everything fine, but it just becomes a drag to read. So not only are the chapters long, it takes a long time for the story to get going, there are entire chapters where it takes a long time for the characters to stop talking and get the story going. So it's just one of those things of where copying a style does not work for this particular author. I don't think Haggard does a good job of emulating Dumas in this particular context. So the final ranking. Given how long I ranted about stuff I didn't like, this is not going to be a very high ranking. But I go by the 5-star ranking, 0 out of 5 being the worst, 5 out of 5 being the best. I would say that this is a 2 out of 5 stars, which, in my opinion, stands for a painfully average story. It's not outright bad, but it's so unmemorable and so plain that you can't really speak to it being that interesting. Because this is a story with a lot of good individual moments, like those action scenes, and a lot of good secondary characters like Betty and Inez, but the writing is so sluggish, and the pacing is so sluggish, and the main characters are so dull that there's a lot of times where it just becomes a chore to read. You're just kind of going, well, okay, I'll read through this, hopefully something happens, and something eventually does, but it's a long time before it happens. So, yeah, this is not a story I would heavily recommend to most people. I would say the only people that you might be who might be interested in this is people who are interested in like the Spanish Inquisition era. If you're interested in that sort of time of Spain, you might find this story interesting. But otherwise, I don't think anybody else would enjoy it all that much. I'm really curious because the other booktuber, I think it was Ray the Librarian. I'll link his channel in the description. He was trying to do read all of the Haggard books this year. So I'm kind of curious to see what his reaction to this story would be, because again, this is a story that hasn't been talked about much. So I'm going to be curious to see who, if somebody has a similar opinion to me, or if they actually think it's stupendous. Any inspiration? For those of you that don't know, I'm a working writer, so when I do these reviews, I like to say whether the story has inspired me or not. And this story actually has inspired me, because I really do want to do a swashbuckler story with a character who is kind of analogous to Betty, because like I said, Betty was the most interesting character, and I think she has the best setup. So doing a story with a Betty character who is sort of stuck in a situation, she has to find a clever way to get her revenge. That's a very cool character setup. I'd like to do something with that in a swashbuckling story context. I also like the idea of religious tensions. I would like kind of to do a story that sort of plays with religious conflicts at the time of the story is taking place. So doing a story there where the religious conflict is emphasized as a major point would be really interesting. Excuse me. All right, well, that is all I have to say about Fair Margaret. Thank you to anyone who was waiting for me to finish up Haggard January. I know this took a while, but this is this was a one of those things that you plan it initially. You think, oh, everything's going to go smoothly, but then other things in life happen. So thank you for your patience if you were waiting for this review. If you saw my Haggard January video, you also know that I said I was going to do a few bonus books. And obviously at this point, we're beyond Haggard January, but I'll probably finish them this month and do my reviews of those bonus books later this month. So keep your eyes out for that. But yeah, that's pretty much it for Fair Margaret. Thank you for everyone who stuck around and listened, and I will see you later. Bye.